Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. Recently I've been doing an overview of each of the Doctors, and today it's the turn of Colin Baker, the 6th Doctor. For many fans of the classic series, Colin Baker's not seen as the best Doctor, or indeed the most popular. The reason for this is manifold. For example, a lot of people grew up during Tom Baker's time, so he became their Doctor by default. Colin Baker only really did 2 years as the Doctor, which means he was a lot less people's first Doctor. Also, his characterisation of the Doctor was a lot more abrupt and a lot more argumentative than many of the Doctor's previous incarnations, with the possible exception of William Hartnell, who a lot of people would say mellowed after Susan had left the crew. So, Colin Baker, who'd been previously seen in the Doctor Who story Arc of Infinity as Commander Maxwell of the Chancellery Guard. A lot of people would have assumed that this meant that he wasn't actually in a position to be able to play the Doctor at all, but he was. Now, another reason a lot of people don't like Colin isn't Colin's fault whatsoever. It's his costume. Now, because of colour separation overlay or blue screen or whatever you decide to call it, the costume was unable to have the colour blue in it. It was, however, a multicoloured patchwork thing. You've all seen it. You still sometimes see it at conventions, people wearing them. It just kind of didn't work for me. And as a child, even the cricket whites of Peter Davison had been a bit far-fetched for my liking. It became a costume more than what he was wearing. Admittedly, it was identifiable, but it was more Max Miller than Time Lord. I know the guy's meant to be slightly eccentric, but it just didn't work for me. There's an audio story, or indeed I think it was a webcast, where the Doctor is seen wearing something different. Even in the Dalek story that I'll be discussing in a moment, the Doctor wears a long, flowing blue or purple cloak, and it just adds something to the character. I think if Colin had been allowed to go on, things would have improved enormously. But let's review the stories, and we'll discuss them as we come to them. In a break with tradition, we'd kind of had Peter Davidson's series finish 4 episodes early. The reason for this was so that the Twin Dilemma, the 6th Doctor's first story, could be part of Peter Davidson's last season. It seemed that would make the crossover a lot more palatable for a lot more fans. Twin Dilemma, however, is not a very good story at all. You were still reeling from the fact that as the Doctor came round from his reincarnation, rather than being a little bit lost, we were presented with someone who actually tried to strangle his assistant. Perry had done very little, and it seemed a little intense. It wasn't the best beginnings, and then the story concerning 2 child actors who were very good at maths, and some sort of slug-like things which looked a bit too much like the Tractators seen earlier that season, just didn't work. Admittedly, the sets suddenly seemed to look cheaper, but it was the story that really let it down. Thinking back, it's not something I've watched on video or even DVD that many times. I will try it again, because as time's gone by, Colin has improved like a fine wine in my eyes. However, I remember at this time, this story just didn't go down well. And then we had the season break, bringing us into season 22. And with a very good season opener, Attack of the Cybermen. Attack of the Cybermen is a lot better watched with a lot less continuity in mind. Unfortunately, the continuity-heavy Peter Davidson era had taken its toll on the Colin Baker era by people kind of dredging through Doctor Who's past and then reintroducing it. However, they were reintroducing it incorrectly. An example of this is in this story. The story of Attack of the Cybermen. The Cybermen are on their own planet, well, one of their own planets, where some locals called the Cryons, so let's face it, it's where Tomb of the Cybermen was set, so I'm guessing it's Telos. The planet Telos apparently has indigenous life form. This has never been mentioned before, and they're all kind of fiberglass-headed, not particularly well-executed monsters. Not monsters, they're sort of freedom fighters, they live in the cold. It's not very well explained. The tombs of the Cybermen, which are located on this world, should, by rights, have the same Cybermen inside of them that were seen in Tomb of the Cybermen. They are, after all, the same Cybermen that are frozen. However, when you thaw them out, they are the current Cybermen design, which just confused you. It confused the fans, it confused the continuity, because the whole point of the story was that the Cybermen that were being reawakened were the ones in the tombs. Not really worth going on about. I'm not being pedantic, I'm actually just pointing out a design flaw in the story. The Cybermen have got a time machine to go back to the distant past of 1986, or was it 1984, when the original Cyberman story is set, when Earth is visited by... You see what I mean? Lots and lots of past history of Doctor Who, a lot of which at the time was completely lost to us, and the only chance we had of knowing anything like this was by reading old novelizations. It was kind of continuity heavy, didn't make a lot of sense if you didn't know the Cybermen's history, and even if you did, that just confused matters even more. It did reintroduce the character of Lytton, who was eventually turned back into a Cyberman. I would watch it, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. Followed by, for what a lot of people is, one of Colin Baker's low points. Vengeance on Varos is a good story. It has some lovely metaphors, some lovely moments, but it also has some terrible moments. The Doctor steps out of the way and somebody falls into a vat of acid. It's kind of a commentary on modern TV and television violence and what Doctor Who had become. I'm not sure it works, and that's 3 stories in a row that I'm not completely sold on. Again, Vengeance on Varos has aged slightly better than other stories. It's followed by the rather strange oddity Mark of the Rani, which for a lot of people is the highlight of Colin's time. Mark of the Rani has Kate O'Mara playing a fellow renegade Time Lord, and it also has the Master in it, played again by the... Everyone says pantomime villain of Anthony Ainley. I'm not even sure that's true. Anthony Ainley does a perfectly good performance in this. Kate O'Mara, however, I think is overacting, but not as much as she will later on during her time with McCoy. It's set, apparently, in a place called Killingworth, and if you can recognise where my accent's from, that's not particularly far from where I'm from. It's set during the Industrial Revolution, and unfortunately has a device that turns people into trees. Not particularly good trees. It would have been better to embrace something else that was more achievable. Say it turned them into a rock, and then you just bring a rock. Or something like that. Oh, it's not worth going into. I really, genuinely did not like the living trees. Shall we move on? I think so. Mark of the Rani is followed by the 2 Doctors. Now, the 2 Doctors is a small, actually it's an extremely large thing, can get it on DVD, it's very nice. It has Patrick Troughton playing the second of the 2 Doctors, who was a friend of Colin Baker, so it was a lot easier to convince him. And it has Jamie McCrimmon's return as well. The problem with this story, for the continuity heavy amongst us, is that at no point did Jamie and the Doctor travel alone in the original run. Also, the design of the TARDIS seems to be wrong. I mean, let's face it, if Trials and Tribulations didn't have bits of the original Star Trek in it, or it had the wrong Star Trek Enterprise in it, people would have complained. So the flight deck of the TARDIS is just wrong, and although it starts in black and white and then it goes into colour, which is a very nice touch, huge sections of it just don't make continuity sense. However, this has led to the existence of a theory called Season 6b. Season 6b is a bit complicated and will be explained another time. Suffice to say, it's the possibility that there is a whole series of Doctor Who that was never made, that doesn't actually exist anywhere other than in fans' imaginations, but it is a great place to stick missing stories and to mess about with readings. A lot of Faction Paradox is based on Lawrence Miles' reading of this, apparently. I was unaware of this until I heard an interview recently with Tat Wood. Whether he was taking the mick or not, I just don't know. I would have to do a lot more research. Either way, it's not worth really going into, because as far as fans were concerned, it was just some continuity mistakes that we weren't meant to notice. Let it go. It's a great story. It's a nice runaround thing. It's filmed in Spain. They make lovely use of the settings. And of course the Sontarans, slightly redesigned, are back once more. It also has the woman who played Servalan in Blake 7 in it. Well worth seeing. Following the Two Doctors is a story that I used to think was a two-parter. Now, it was the first story I ever recorded onto video. Not VHS, but Betamax. And the tapes still survive to this day. Bless. Betamax was a wonderful system. The tapes were enormously expensive, and so a bit of judicious editing and hanging around with the pause button while the engines whirred into life was always a good thing. No such thing as YouTube or torrent sharing or anything like that in those days. You knew the BBC had taped over their episodes, so you weren't going to risk them vanishing again. You were going to record everything. And so, Time Lash was the first thing I ever recorded, and I got to watch that a lot during the hiatus. Yes, I know many of you old school fans are actually feeling a little sorry for me now, thinking that the only Doctor Who I had access to during the hiatus was Time Lash. Time Lash is seen by many people as possibly the worst story ever. I wouldn't go that far. It did confuse me as a child when I was watching it, because it was on, and in the story they refer to a story earlier with John Pertwee visiting this planet, and I went through the episode guides at the time desperately trying to find this missing story. But the point was that we'd never seen it on TV. It was just referred to. So apparently the Third Doctor had been to this planet, helped out, and when the Sixth Doctor arrives at the end of episode 1, he's missing for like hours of the story, and the rest of the story nothing's happening. Oh, it's got H.G. Wells in it, it's got monsters, it's got quite a good puppet alien. No, really, it is good. I like it. I like the... Alright, let's just move on. Watch Time Lash, watch it once. It's not as bad as everyone else makes out. It's followed by the remarkably good Revelation of the Daleks. Revelation of the Daleks was discussed during the Dalek overview, but basically Davros has set himself up as a person called the Great Healer. The Doctor visits the planet Necros, wears blue, looks better. On Necros, Davros is using bits of the dead bodies of the dead. Obviously, the dead bodies of the dead. Am I talking nonsense? He's using bits of dead bodies to create new Daleks. Old Daleks turn up to go, "Oi, Davros, now!" They take Davros back to their world, and he isn't seen again until halfway through, well, until near the end of the McCoy era. It's fine. So, we still have the Doctor, we still have Perry, the Daleks are defeated, the planet Necros is safe, however Doctor Who is not. Doctor Who is taken away from us for a year and a bit. There's just nothing. We're told it's a hiatus. Now, hiatus was a whole new word to us, and it still strikes fear into us. It struck fear into us quite recently when the BBC decided not to have many episodes following 2008's season. 2008? When did that happen? Good God. So, the hiatus happens. We're all a bit worried. But we are promised that Doctor Who will return, and it will return better. And it does return. It returns with the Mysterious Planet. Mysterious Planet is the name that we've given to Trial of a Time Lord. Trial of a Time Lord is the name of the entire season. Season 23. Season 23 is all right if watched as individual stories. There are 4 individual stories making up this season, unlike, say, perhaps The Key to Time. The first of the four is the mysterious planet. The Doctor materialises on a strange planet that's very similar to Earth. On this planet, he discovers that there are tribes, there are some people living underground, and they are inhabiting an area that looks very much like the London Underground system, only futuristic. And they are looked over by a benevolent robot called Drathro, not Jethro, as many people say. And on top, we have Joan Sims running a sort of ancient tribe, and as part of this, a trader called Sabalon Glitz has arrived from another world to try and steal something from the robot. Quite a nice story. However, all of this is framed around the remarkably dull trial of the Time Lord. The Sixth Doctor is put on trial. He's got out of the TARDIS by himself, which is worrying, and he's put on trial by the bloke who used to do the Stoke adverts and the woman from the Oxo adverts. Now, the Doctor's put on trial. He's been on trial before, let's face it, and it could echo that the BBC also had the Doctor on trial at this point. Would the Doctor survive? Would he not? We just don't know. He's on trial for breaking the laws of time, for messing about with stuff. So, this story, The Mysterious Planet, which is quite well done. The Doctor is getting on considerably better with Perry. The action's good, it's filmed outside, it looks good. There's some violence, not a huge amount. So much so that the controller of the BBC, a certain Michael Grade, says, "Well done, the effects finally look great. You can have this whole new series, you can bring it back, yes." And then goes quiet. Mindwarp is the second of the four. Mindwarp is an odd story. Again, it has Syl, who was last seen in Vengeance on Varos, doing experiments with people's minds, bodies, genetics, all that kind of nonsense. It's got a character called King Yakanos, played by Brian Blessed, who can't not shout. And unfortunately, he's asked to knock it down to 11 in this story. And as a watcher, you're kind of hoping that nobody you know is watching Doctor Who. You never feel embarrassment like this, but it's in there. You're beginning to see what everyone else says they could have seen some time ago. It's not great. You get the sinking feeling. And then to add insult to injury, Perry is killed. Or is she? You know, I'm never completely sure. But at the end of this story, Perry gets killed. The Doctor's beginning to lose his temper. He's losing his trial. His interference has ended up with his companion being killed. And then we go into the third story, which is Terror of the Vervoids. They tried to go for an Agatha Christie thing. Terror of the Vervoids has got triffidy, monstery, walk-around plant things who want to kill people. And in the end, the Doctor commits genocide and wipes them all out. He's responsible for genocide and is therefore guilty and will be punished by de-resolution or being taped over or something. Oh, the excitement's almost there. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sounding cynical and nasty, but by this point we were all panicking. It then led into the denouement for the whole series, and God, we hoped it would be good. You found out that the villain of the piece wasn't the Master, it was the prosecutor known as the Valeyard. The Valeyard was possibly the gap between the 12th and 13th incarnation of the Doctor, or possibly not, or possibly he was Evil Doctor. Nobody really explained it. And that's where this season falls down. You had no idea. So, I've missed a terribly important part of this. Bonnie Langford. I'm sorry I'm using those words. I might have to put down that this podcast is down as explicit, because I will be using the words Bonnie Langford quite a lot from now on. With Perry dead, the next story, the Terror of the Vervoids episode of the trial, if you see what I mean, was meant to be taking place in the future of the Doctor. And in the future, the Doctor had a new companion, who was Bonnie Langford. And the fans were in tears. We'd lost Perry, for God's sake. And we had... I'm sorry, I don't really want to go on. She was there. She was Ginger. Now, we'd had Turlough. Turlough was a perfectly acceptable Ginger companion. But this was Langford. This was the girl who... I'm sorry, we could actually see the writing on the wall at this point. They were trying to kill the series using this woman and using Colin's performance of someone who wasn't as easily accessible as everyone else. We were in tears inside. And so, the Doctor's new companion, Langford, and then he tries to take on... Oh, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. The Ultimate Foe is a mess. The Ultimate Foe makes no sense. It tries to explain away everything from the end. It feels rushed. It feels badly made. Just don't do it to yourself. However, it marks the end of Colin's time. It's a very unceremonious end. He wins the trial. He defeats the Valeyard. But by this point, you're just panicking. And then, rather unceremoniously, Colin is sacked. Reasons for his sacking have been disputed through fandom for a long time, and it wasn't until a certain interview by the producer's boyfriend just before his death that appeared in Doctor Who Monthly that people were unfamiliar with the real reasons behind Colin Baker's removal from the series. Suffice to say that no matter what happens, it was a certain Michael Grade's decision to bring Doctor Who back, but only bring him back with somebody else. I'll cover John Nathan Turner's time producing Doctor Who in a different podcast. It's complicated, and it's seen by some as a good thing or a bad thing. But let's face it, without GNT, the series wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. So by this point, we're all panicking a bit. But then it will come back with Sylvester McCoy. And a lot of people will be happy, and a lot of people will be sad. Fandom's falling apart. We're complaining about many things, and if we are listened to by the BBC at this point, then we also want the series to end. Was somebody listening to us? Was it our own fault that the series went away? Is that why we're frightened to say anything bad about the new series? We'll never know. It was the past, and they did things very differently then. Or was it the same? Let's give marks out of 10 for this and then call this to an end. The Twin Dilemma. I'll give it a 6. Let's face it, we'd rather watch bad Doctor Who than anything else on Earth. Attack of the Cybermen. I had given it a 7. I want to give it an 8. Vengeance on Varos. Back down to 7. The Two Doctors, an 8. But as far as Colin Baker's time's called, I would say, a 10. It's a good story. Time Lash. At the time, an 8. It was all I had. But, looking back, a 6. Revelation of the Daleks, an 8. Well worth seeing. The Mysterious Planet, it came back with such power, such panache, such incredibly good acting, that I'm going to give that one an 8. Mindwarp, a 7. Terror of the Vervoids, a 4. The Ultimate Foe, a 6. And that's it. That's the Colin Baker time. Of course it's not. Colin Baker made some other performances, some other showings. He appeared on Radio 4 in the series Slipback, which was very good, but contradicted many things that had just been proven a season earlier during Peter Davidson's time on board Terminus. The origins of the universe can be discussed at a completely different time. And of course, Colin did return with Big Finish. Not only did he make up for the perceived sins, not the actual sins seen by fans, but Colin has rapidly become one of the best Doctors and the most anticipated story Doctors you can come across. I will cover his stories, the Big Finish ones, in a completely different podcast, similarly to the Davidson and the McCoy and the McGann podcasts. And the McGann CDs, all later. However, this brings the overview of Colin Baker's time to an end. Be seeing you.